Thank you all for joining us for today's new series, America and the Holocaust. We want to formally thank our partners for today's event, Liberation 75 and the Holocaust Memorial Resource and Education Center of Florida. In each of these sessions, Dr. Michael Berenbaum will explore the complicated debate surrounding America's role in the Holocaust. Each session will feature a scholar whose work will shed new light on this topic and challenge us to reframe our understanding of the complex portrait of national inaction. Today's session will feature a discussion surrounding Ben Heck, the legendary writer who mobilized Hollywood on behalf of the European Jews, featuring Rick Richmond. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, my name is Ellen Resnick, and I'm the Educational Programs and Outreach Manager at Classrooms Without Borders. Classrooms Without Borders is a premier provider of experiential professional development for teachers, educational leaders, and lifelong learners. We offer unique travel experiences and virtual learning opportunities enriched with academic literature, relevant content, and resources to enhance the learning experience. We do this through an authentic exploration into a complex narrative, engaging with scholars, fellow educators, experts, and contemporary witnesses, with the primary focus being the importance that historical place plays on our shared history. We are thankful for all your support over the years, and most especially these past 3 years of navigating our expanded presence for CWB, while also supporting all of these robust offerings. Over the past 3 years alone, we have offered 434 virtual programs with over 72,000 participants, reaching almost 60 countries and almost all of the United States. If you'd like to make a donation to support our organization, I will drop the link in the chat for you in just a few moments. And now I have the pleasure of introducing today's guests. Dr. Michael Berenbaum is a writer, lecturer, and teacher consulting in the conceptual development of museums and historical films. He is the director of the Ziggy Zarig Institute, exploring the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust, and the American Jewish University, where he's also a professor of Jewish studies. Joining him today is Rick Richmond, a resident scholar at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles. He has written for a commentary, Mosaic, the New York Sun, the Jewish Journal, the Jewish Press, the New York Post, PJ Media, and other publications. He is the author of Racing Against History, the 1940 campaign for a Jewish army to fight Hitler, that was put out in 2018 by Encounter Books, and his new book, entitled "And None Shall Make Them Afraid: 8 Stories of the Modern State of Israel," is coming out on February 28th. Please send any questions you have directly to Michael in the chat, and we will try our best to field them all. Thank you very much. And with that, Michael, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm thoroughly delighted to be here with my friend and colleague. And in fact, I would call him my sparring mate, because we have wonderful dialogues and he makes going to the office an absolute pleasure. Rick Richmond. Rick, I'm going to ask one question, but before that, I have to disagree with you on one thing on the title of this. I'm going to say that Ben Hecht did not mobilize Hollywood. He mobilized the English language as his tool for it. But let's begin with a very basic question. Who was Ben Hecht, and why the hell was he so important? And why is it sad that he's forgotten?
You know, the best way to give you a sense of his importance is to note that in 1964, when he died suddenly at the age of 70, the New York Times put his obituary on the first page of its Sunday edition, and it ran for more than 2,000 words onto 4 columns in an interior page in the New York Times. For someone who was basically a writer, a screenwriter, and who mobilized, I would say, not only Hollywood and perhaps not only the English language, but all of the United States in a way that we'll undoubtedly get into later in this colloquy. But he was born in 1894 on the Lower East Side of New York to Russian Jewish immigrant parents. He grew up in Wisconsin, He attended the University of Wisconsin for 1 day and left and went to Chicago to become a writer. And there he was with some famous writers of the day, Theodore Dreiser, Carl Sandburg, and others. And at the age of 27, he published his first novel, which made him a national literary figure. And his journalism created a whole new form of journalism as a crime reporter, as a human interest reporter. He went to Berlin and was a foreign correspondent for 2 years right after World War I, witnessed the political violence there, reported on it. And then he received from his friend Herman Mankiewicz in Hollywood, probably the most famous telegram in movie history. Mankiewicz wanted him to come out to Hollywood to write screenplays for $300 a week, which probably was a fair amount of money back at that time in the late 1920s. The telegram read, and I think I've got it almost exactly, the $300 is peanuts, but there's millions to be made out here, and your only competition is idiots. Don't let this get around. So he went out, and in 11 days, he produced the screenplay, or a treatment for a screenplay, of the first gangster movie called Underworld. And he won an Oscar for it at the first Academy Awards in 1929. And then he did the second movie, which is more famous, I'm sure, to our listeners, and that was Scarface, which was a film based on Al Capone. And he single-handedly established the gangster movie as a new genre of American film. And so he was a crime reporter. He was a human interest reporter. His human interest stories that he did daily were compiled and published in 2 volumes. He wrote the novel Eric Dorn and became famous as a novelist. He wrote 250 short stories in his career. He wrote 20 plays, including Broadway plays, that some of which were absolute smashes. He wrote 65 screenplays. He got 6 Oscar nominations and won 2 Oscars for them. And in the 50s, 1954, when he published his autobiography, A Child of the Century, it was reviewed by Saul Bellow on the front page of the Sunday New York Times Book Review, who gave it a rave review. Time magazine called it one of the most important books published since Time magazine had begun publishing almost 100 years before. And Yossi Klein Halevi, who's a very prominent Israeli author, listed it among the 5 books that every educated Jew should read. So we can get into a little bit more, I'm sure we will, what his activities were and how he mobilized this. But the breadth of his achievement is extraordinary in American literature, American cinema, American political activity, and certainly the events of the Holocaust.
But you know very well that our concern today is the events of the Holocaust, but you gave us a wonderful background as to who he was. Tell us before, and we're going to tease our audience a little bit, we'll get to who he was during the Holocaust. Tell us a little bit about his pre-Holocaust Jewish involvement.
I can give you a shorter answer on that one. It was nil. He basically said he had never experienced any anti-Semitism for 40 years. His first 40 years of his life, which he wrote in his autobiography, was a record for a Jew, or more likely a record for a country. He didn't go to synagogue. He wasn't religious. He really had no Jewish involvement or institutional connections until 1939, and right after Kristallnacht. That's really the beginning.
So take us through that story, Rick.
Okay, well, first we need just a brief description of Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht itself it's a German term given for what was really a 2-day state-sponsored pogrom in Germany. It's called
now
Christ-
called, let me just say, it's now called by German historian the November 1938 Reichspogroms.
Yeah.
And it's important that they use the plural because it was a regional series of pogroms in a variety of different cities and different places. So that coordinated and centralized, but it really was a series of pogroms. And the word Kristallnacht was designed to make to put lipstick on a pig.
Indeed, you think of Kristallnacht as the night of broken glass, as if a bunch of windows in various places were smashed. But in fact, there were 1,000 synagogues that were burned during the 2 days. There were 7,000 Jewish businesses that were gutted. There were hundreds of Jews who were killed. There were 30,000 Jews who were rounded up and sent to Dachau and other concentration camps. And so it was an extraordinary event. And what was extraordinary to Ben Heck was the silence of American Jews in response to that event. It was covered on the front pages of the New York Times, but Stephen S. Wise and the other Jewish leaders made a considered judgment that there should be no protests, no parades. It should not be treated as a Jewish event because it would be looked at as special pleading. So they adopted a policy of silence. And what Ben Heck did, at least his first involvement on this issue, was he published a book in 1939, the year after Kristallnacht, in June. Kristallnacht was November 9th and 10th. And the book is called The Book of Miracles. And the review by the New York Times said the book itself was something of a miracle. The stories in it were worthy of Tolstoy. And the main story was a story called The Little Candle. And it was about an international pogrom executed by Germany and its allies, in which 500,000 Jews were killed. And to a certain extent, this story was prophetic because although the book was published June 1st, 1939, really 7 months is not enough time to write a major story as this was, get it edited, get it put into a book, and get that book published and distributed in that period of time. So most biographers, the two latest ones for sure, of Ben Heck, think it was written in 1937 or 1938, in which case it was prophetic. But this story of an international pogrom is something that it's little known today. It probably ought to be a part of every course of American literature, certainly American Jewish literature, because the moral force, the literary power, and the writing itself compares favorably with the short stories of Hemingway and Fitzgerald. And it goes way beyond those because it's a portrayal of Judaism as a religion of solace, but not of protection. And the story is one that is essentially a call to arms, not to wait for God, not to retreat into religion, but to meet the threat that he either foresaw or certainly knew was brewing after Kristallnacht.
Yeah, let's put it in a drop of context, and that is that World War II did not begin until September 1, 1939. The systematic structural murder of Jews did not begin till June 22nd, 1941, with the German invasion of Soviet-held territories. And the death camps were not operational until 1942, with the exception of Chelmno that opened in December 8th, 1941. So envisioning 500,000 Jews being killed is sort of you use the word prophetic, it's sort of forecasting what is to occur. It's not even, we didn't even hear at that point the word annihilation coming first from the mouth of Hitler. That was January 30th, 39. So it's an incredible sense of foretelling the future.
And absolutely. I mean, the standard, I wouldn't call it excuse, but explanation for some of the passivity of the time was that you couldn't imagine what eventually happened. And in fact, Ben Heck imagined it, not in the scope, but 500,000 Jews after Kristallnacht, where 30,000 were rounded up. That's quite an extraordinary thing, even if it was written after Kristallnacht. If it was written before.
And half a million Jews, let's remind our listeners, 500,000 Jews was the population of Germany. 525,000 Jews lived in Germany for the war. So 500,000 is getting it, unfortunately, quite right.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's,
so what then happened?
Okay, so this is an indication of how riled up Ben Heck got, having had no prior experience with the issue, but now fully engaged. And in his autobiography, he writes that in 1941, he was walking down the street and bumped into history in the person of Peter Bergson. Peter Bergson his real name was Hillel Cook. He was the relative of the great rabbi in Palestine at the time. He adopted a pseudonym of Peter Bergson so that his Zionist activities wouldn't embarrass the family. And he wanted to have a meeting with Ben Hecht because Ben Hecht, he thought, could help him mobilize public opinion in America. So he wrote to Ben Hecht, he wrote again, people called Ben Hecht, and they finally met at the 21 Club in Manhattan. And you have to imagine, if you can, that here's Ben Hecht, he's in his mid-40s. He's the most famous person, certainly screenwriter, in Hollywood. And here is Peter Bergson, who's 25. Nobody knows who he is. And he finally gets a meeting with Ben Hecht to have a drink. And that meeting goes on for 3 hours. And Ben Hecht learns about someone he'd never heard of before. He says Vladimir Jabotinsky, and what Peter Bergson was doing in America, which was trying to mobilize public opinion to support a Jewish army to join the fight against Hitler. And this is all before Pearl Harbor, when America gets propelled into the war. So the two of them were there. They have this conversation, and that conversation is at least as historic, really, as the Mankiewicz telegram was in terms of film history, in terms of Jewish history, because once Ben Hecht gave his name to the movement, then it took off, and he was asked to give a speech at 20th Century Fox. He said he had never given a speech. He had never raised money. He had never even participated in meetings. He had no interest in Palestine. He didn't think he had, by experience or temperament, he could do it, but he gave a speech to 1,000 people. And he said it was as if I had changed my name and gone off to a new land. And he was off to the races in terms of his speeches and articles, and eventually a pageant.
What do you think changed? I mean, you've described how he sensed that he totally changed. You, as an outside observer, what changed in him? What happened?
You know, what changed was he saw the Jews of the Lower East Side, where he had been born and grown up. They were concerned, but they were powerless. And then he looked at his fellow Jews in his level of society at the height of their power in film and literature and journalism, and they were saying nothing. And he said, he wrote later on, my response to being attacked as a Jew was to become a Jew and defend myself as one. And he said in 1939, when this started, I became a Jew, and I also became an American, because he believed that what he was fighting for was not a Jewish cause, or at least not only a Jewish cause, but an American cause. And he said, look, for those people who think that we should keep quiet about this, lest it become just a Jewish cause. If I speak up for people who are in distress, and I speak louder than my fellow American, is it because I'm Jewish, or is it because perhaps I'm more American? And so he was melding his Jewish activism with what he thought were American ideals, and he was very thankful for having grown up in America and having had the career he had. And he just decided that it was his obligation, both as a Jew and as an American, to mobilize people in support of the Jews who were defenseless in Europe.
So tell us a little bit about the partnership between Peter Bergson and Ben Hecht. And I guess we could add to that, if Ben Hecht was the writer, Arthur Szyk was the illustrator.
Yes, yes. And Ben Hecht, to his credit, got other people in Hollywood, such as Billy Rose, Kurt Weill, Paul Mooney, Edward G. Robinson, other people involved in the cause as well. He would eventually write a play in which the star was 22-year-old Marlon Brando in his first appearance. So Hecht had the ability, given his personal charisma and his stature, to bring these people in by virtue of the fact that he was involved. And Bergson had this tremendous organizational zeal and ability. And the two of them put together were an extraordinary example of how individuals can affect history. Because without either one of them, probably what we're talking about today wouldn't have happened. It required two extraordinary individuals and an extraordinary partnership.
And tell us, for those who don't know, what did they do together?
Okay, so they went and spoke, and then Peter Bergson got the funding for full-page ads that were put in the New York Times and elsewhere, including poems that were written by Hecht that were amazingly caustic about ignoring what was happening in Europe, and calling upon people to respond. And so this partnership extended throughout the country, and it became Ben Hecht's real purpose in life. When he finally wrote his autobiography, A Child of the Century, he devoted twice as many pages to these activities, starting with himself and Peter Bergson and going through the 1950s, as he did to his Hollywood career. And his Hollywood career was historic. So it really took over his life, and he devoted his life to it. And he gave speeches, he wrote the plays, he wrote the Broadway. He did a pageant, as I said, called We Will Never Die in 1943. In 1942, he wrote an article for Esquire magazine, which had a huge circulation at the time. And it was called A Champion in Chains. And he called attention to the fact that the Middle East was really becoming the focus of the war in that year, because that's where oil was, that's where strategic checkpoints were. There was a general who thought that from Palestine would come the invasion of the continent that would eventually end the war, and that therefore whoever controlled Palestine would win the war. And Ben Hecht wrote, there are 200,000 men of military age in Palestine, Jews of no country because they had no citizenship, and they are willing to form a Jewish army. And that was a considerable force at a strategic part of the world. And then in 1943, in February, he wrote probably his most famous article, which was called The Extermination of the Jews. It was published in the American Mercury, but then it was republished in the Reader's Digest. The Reader's Digest
Reader's
being the
Digest,
magazine,
well, everybody read the Reader's Digest in that.
the magazine that, as you say, everybody read. And this article went through 15 cities with paragraphs that all began with remember us when we were stood up without water or food in the trains and were transported out of our home countries to Nazi-occupied Poland, and most of us dying before we got there. Remember us in other cities where our rabbis were flogged in front of our eyes. Remember us when they came in during Yom Kippur services and required us to clean latrines with our talit. It was an extraordinarily powerful article. And what he ended with was the French, the English, the Americans, the Poles, a long list of nationalities would get justice after the war, but not the Jews. And the reason was, he said, the Jews will be a phantom by then if we don't do anything. And so this was converted into a pageant, and it played at Madison Square Garden in March of 1943. It began at 8:45. They had to sell out more tickets at 11:45. The demand to see it was so great. 40,000 people saw it. It then toured the country. It left and went to Washington, D.C., where Eleanor Roosevelt was in the...
Eleanor Roosevelt, who's going to be the subject of our next series on this. Eleanor Roosevelt went to see it in Washington, D.C.
And spoiler alert, she put it in her column, and which was nationwide, distributed nationwide, and the pageant went out across the country. It ended up at the Hollywood Bowl and was broadcast by NBC Radio nationwide. So this event, which wouldn't have happened but for Ben Hecht, and which for the script for which he wrote, changed history, because it created an atmosphere in the country where the issue couldn't be ignored. And in late 1943 and then January 1944, the issue came directly to FDR's desk in the form of a memorandum and a meeting by Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. And that led to the establishment of the War Refugee Board, run by John Pele, which saved thousands and thousands, probably tens of thousands of Jews. And as we know in Jewish tradition, every life is a world. So it was a small number in compared to those who died, but it was a large number in terms of the effect that it had. And it's a result of what Ben Hecht did.
But we also should say that it was 11 years into, I mean, it was established, think of it, it was established on January 22nd, 1944. Hitler took power on January 30th, 1933. And the United States only formally got into the business of rescue. 10 years and 365 minus 8, right? 310 years and 357 days.
Yeah.
After Hitler came to power. And we had the capacity then to save tens of thousands, though John Pele, to his enormous credit when he gave his oral history, and I had the privilege of taking his oral history on that, said, too little, too late. We did too little and we did it too late. Yeah. And that's the man who was responsible for tens of thousands, perhaps as many as 100,000 lives.
Yeah. And he wrote a memo in 1944 saying, even Britain doesn't, with the establishment of the War Refugee Board, even Britain thinks it's a campaign stunt for Roosevelt's re-election campaign in 1944. So he faced tremendous headwinds, which makes his own personal accomplishment quite extraordinary. But you're absolutely right. Virtually nothing was done by the Roosevelt administration until early 1944, when it came to a head. And the argument for FDR is always that, well, he had a war to win. And this was one aspect of it. But his view, and those who explain his inaction, is that the best way to save Jewish lives was to win the war. And so nothing should be done to distract from the military aspects of it. But we also have, the minutes of a meeting with FDR, which quite dramatically show that even when Stephen S. Wise came in, because of his personal request to his personal friend, FDR monopolized the conversation and nothing really got done. And so when you look at when you compare Stephen S. Wise, who was the leading figure, or certainly one of them, in American Jewry at this period of time, a personal friend of the president, a personal friend of Sumner Welles, who was the Undersecretary of State, more or less responsible for this issue, was really not able to get anything done. But one person, Ben Heck, wrote things and got a pageant produced that actually brought to a head what could be done, but wouldn't have been done without his own efforts. So it's a remarkable story of how somebody without any institutional affiliations, without any real money of his own, through his own eloquence, his own pen, produced this. And when he died in 1964, Menachem Begin flew from Israel and spoke at his funeral in New York. And he said that Ben Heck wielded his pen as if it were a sword. And that really is true of what Heck's contribution was.
Why do you think he's forgotten?
I'm sorry?
Why do you think he's forgotten, Rick?
Well, he was, we don't know for sure, but a lot of people think that the American Jewish community was uncomfortable after the war with what I would call three major feelings. One was kind of survivor's guilt for those who were alive, a bit of bystander's guilt for not doing more, and finally the sheer shock of finding out the details of what happened during the Holocaust. And you put that all together, and it was uncomfortable to know that there was this guy who was supporting Menachem Begin, who was on the military right of the Jewish spectrum, and had challenged even the sainted FDR. And it became something that people would rather forget rather than commemorate. And it wasn't until two recent biographies, major biographies, written in 2018, 2019, that Heck really regained the prominence that he once had. His books were republished in paperback. The two biographies are quite good. And he has regained, I think, at this point, a measure of the credit he deserves, but not completely.
He also had enormous credibility. We should say this. He also had enormous credibility in Hollywood for one other talent of his. He was known as the fastest rewrite man in business, which meant everybody wanted him when they needed him.
Yeah, Otto Preminger's.
You pick up a couple of chits that way.
That's how you write 65 screenplays while doing all these other things. Otto Preminger said that Ben Heck could have become a major figure in American literature, but he always had a job in Hollywood, and he never had the time. And it was because he was in demand, and he was the major guy in terms of screenwriting.
We're asked by Patricia Gaston, tell us what the pageant consisted of, and also who participated in the pageant, because this also gives you the sense Peter Bergson could not have gotten these people without Ben Hecht.
Yeah,
it was virtually a who's who of Hollywood.
Yeah, it's a thank you for that question. It was put on with a stage with two massive columns with the Ten Commandments on each column, and this table in the front where 120 Jews throughout history who were great figures in Western civilization would come forward and state briefly what they had done. And then would come forward ghosts from each of the 15 communities in Europe that had been wiped out. And it was an extraordinarily moving thing, as Eleanor Roosevelt wrote. And it had Paul Mooney and Kurt Weill involved in it. Great names in Hollywood.
If I remember correctly, it had Clark Gable and it had Edward G. Robinson. And the other thing we should also point out, I guess, is that many of these people had come from similar Jewish backgrounds like the Lower East Side.
Yeah.
They had changed their name and gone native.
Yeah.
And this was called them back. If he could do it, they could do it.
Yeah. And I know you have said, to me a number of times that at this point in time, the Jews were powerless, but they were not passive. And they came forward when they had the opportunity to. And I always think that it's a bit of unfair of us to look back and be critical at all for the way Jews, even if they didn't respond or didn't respond fully, did that, because that was a different time in America for Jews. They were first or second generation. You had Father Coughlin, you had Lindbergh, you had other people. Anti-Semitism was rife. Gallup polls showed that Jews were not popular. So to come forward took huge amount of courage, and Ben Heck is the tip of that iceberg. I'm more concerned about our generation. We live in unprecedented security and political freedom, and we have social media at our fingertips. There's no excuse for us not taking advantage of what we've got to fight anti-Semitism and what's going on in the world.
Let's also say, Rick, we've been asked by Stephen, what are the name of the two biographies? You and I should also pitch that there's going to be a movie in about another year. There'll be a good documentary on Hecht as well.
Yeah, Aviva Kempner, who is a great documentarian, is working on a documentary of Ben Hecht. It should be terrific. The two, I wish I had them at my fingertips. One is by Auerbach, who took a PhD thesis and turned it into really a compelling book and almost an authoritative book. And then there's a Jewish Lives series book. Whose author I'm sorry, I don't have at my fingertips, but you can easily find it if you go to Amazon and just click on Ben Hecht biographies, and you'll find it. And they're both worth reading. They're both good. The Jewish Lives one is shorter and more easily read. The Auerbach one is longer, but it is comprehensive. You almost have to read both.
I guess we should also put a pitch in. Jewish Lives is a very interesting series by Yale University Press. Having writers write about some of the most prominent Jews of Jewish history, and most especially of the 19th and 20th century, in a very accessible and very readable manner, without lots of technical scholarship and all of that.
Yeah.
When you have a Ben Hecht part of that, you really are able to see it in a popular, but I don't dismiss it as a popular fashion.
Yeah. The other thing I'd recommend is this book. I guess you can't quite see it because partly as a result of those two biographies which came out, they republished A Child of the Century, Ben Hecht's autobiography, the one that had great acclaim in the 1950s, and that Yossi Klein Halevi says every educated Jew ought to read it. And I concur in that. It's a marvelous book, and it's an important book in American Jewish history. And I guess if you're going to read one thing by Ben Heck, that would be the thing to read.
But while you're at it, why don't you tell us a little bit about your book?
Oh, thank you. I have a book coming out.
I'm giving you a softball question. Even
Yeah,
you,
I should be able to handle it.
even you should be able to answer that question.
The name of my book, it's coming out on February 28th from
And
Encounter
by the way,
Books.
lest you all think I'm being impolite, I'm being impolite with a guest. This is our the way in which we talk on a routine. So I'm just not on my proper company behavior.
Well, you made an invaluable contribution by reading it in manuscript and giving me so many leads and correcting errors that would be embarrassing to have to admit today in this broadcast. So I thank you. The name of the book is And None Shall Make Them Afraid. A biblical quotation from Micah actually appears in the Tanakh in various places. And the subtitle is 8 Stories of the Modern State of Israel. And what I've done is I've tried to take 8 individuals who were important figures in modern Zionist history and tell little known stories about them. And in the course of it, illustrate and show Zionist history from 1895, when we start with Theodore Herzl, go to Louis Brandeis in 1912, 1914, when he became the leader of the American Zionist movement. We all remember Brandeis for being one of the great Supreme Court justices in history, but his influence on Zionism was quite significant.
And he also said, we also said, and this again dovetails with Ben Heck, because Brandeis said, the more I become a Zionist, or the better Zionist I become, the better American I become.
Yeah. Yep.
And we that's an echo that's echoed in Ben Hecht.
And it's actually a theme that I've tried to develop in this book, because 4 of the people that I deal with are raised or born in America. 4 of them are raised or born in Europe. And it was the conjunction of Zionism in these 2 areas that produced the state of Israel. So from Louis Brandeis, we go to Chaim Weizmann and the story of his trip in 1919 across the plains of Jordan to meet with the Arab commander-in-chief of the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. And the 2 of them in a tent agreed upon what should be done in the Middle East for the respective national aspirations of both the Jews and the Arabs. They came back, and in London, in an agreement brokered by Lawrence of Arabia, they signed an agreement to that effect in 1919. And then you go to Vladimir Jabotinsky and his meetings in the 1930s with members of parliament, the British Peel Commission, and Winston Churchill himself, which was a very important meeting. And that little known story is told in the book. We then go to Golda Meir, not when she was the 71-year-old grandmother that we all remember as prime minister, but when she was a 40-year-old woman living in Palestine. Her name was Golda Meyerson still at the time, and sent to the Evian conference in 1938 to witness what happened or didn't happen there. It's an incredible story. And then we go to Ben Hecht, and then we go to the 2 major Israeli ambassadors. First, Abba Eban, who was appointed at age 33. He was a former professor of Hebrew, Arabic, and Persian literature. And he became Israel's ambassador to the UN, or representative, before they were admitted. And 5 days later, he's before the UN Security Council giving a speech as Israel's attacked on all sides by Arab armies. It's an incredible moment. And finally,
he was ambassador to the United States and ambassador to the UN
at the same time.
at the same time.
And one was in New York and the other was in Washington, and he did both jobs.
And that's before they had the shuttle.
And then he became foreign minister for almost a decade. It's an extraordinary career. And some of the speeches he gave are speeches that, even though they were 50 or 60 years ago, are still relevant because the issues are still with us. And they bear reading, along with the daily news. Reading some of these speeches gives you a perspective you wouldn't otherwise get. And that's the same thing with Ron Dermer, who's the before the current ambassador, was the ambassador under both the Obama and the Trump administrations. And he gave a series of speeches that, in my view, really are quite eloquent in terms of the issues that Zionism faces today or within the last decade. And they're not published. I had to go find them and excuse me, and put them out there. And I think they're worth reading.
Now, where does Ben Heck fit into the history of Zionism?
After the war, when 6 million were gone, Ben Heck turned his attention to the movement for a Jewish state. And he produced a play called The Flag is Born. Flag is Born. And it was produced on Broadway. Everybody that he got involved, including himself, waived their wages or their royalties. And this play was put on for a couple of weeks, but it went on for 4 months and then toured the country as well. And in it, it's an extraordinarily eloquent play, starring, as I said, Marlon Brando as 22-year-old David, the son of Holocaust survivors, who's now in Palestine fighting for Jewish sovereignty. And he stands on the stage and he turns to the audience at one point, and he says to the audience, and a large proportion of the audience at this point are American Jews. He says to the audience, "You Jews, where were you when we were in the gas chambers and we heard your silence? Where were you? Now you have things to say and you have $1 to give to the Jews. Thank you. Thank you." And it's a chilling speech, but it served to mobilize Jewish support in America for a Jewish state, which still at that point was controversial. It was by no means clear that there was going to be a Jewish state or that the United States and the State Department would support it. And so what Ben Heck did with that play is quite significant. And finally, he gave a speech organized by one of his gangster friends. He had gangster friends from way back with that first movie that he produced when he created the gangster movie as a genre. It was Mickey Cohen, who had taken over from Bugsy Siegel, who died a premature death under mafia circumstances, and was now running the rackets in Los Angeles. And he does this. He said he gives a speech to all these people who Mickey Cohen has gotten at Slapsy Mapski's. And this is one of the most extraordinary speeches given in modern Jewish history. Goes on for 45 minutes. In my book, I quote some paragraphs. The paragraphs themselves are just amazing. And so Ben Heck, he started in 1938, 1939. A decade later, he was still going full force.
I think there's an interesting new book which I will share with you because you'll be intrigued by it, but the audience may be also interested in it. It's on the Jewish gangsters versus the Nazis. You know, there's been and this goes back to our major subject of America and the Holocaust. There's been a series of local books on the history of local communities and the organization of the pro-Nazi universe of America in the 1930s. Hitler in Los Angeles, the Nazis at Copley Square in Boston, And now there's a new book on the Jewish mob and the Nazis, which shows that indeed the Jewish mobsters were organized to break up Nazi plots. And again, just because Jews were powerless did not make them passive. And one of the very cute lines in that is that one of the people who was engaged in this was an American Jewish boxing champion from Chicago by the name of Barney Ross.
Yeah.
And Barney Ross was in said, you know, I can't hit anybody because my fists are licensed as a deadly weapon, and it would be attempted murder. So they gave him a club. They gave him a baseball bat. Said the baseball bat is not the, and he went in swinging with a baseball bat. We're also asked, where can we get copies of Ben Hecht's speeches? You may have mentioned it, but the person did not hear you.
Yeah, no, I don't think I did mention it, actually. Where I would refer listeners to is to go to the Jewish Review of Books, and in the search engine, search for Ben Hecht. And the title of the article, which has almost the complete speech, is a stone for his slingshot. At the end of the speech that Ben Hecht gave at the Slapsy Maxis in 1948, he says to the audience, the Jews in Palestine are fighting for our honor. David is confronting Goliath. What we can do is buy him a stone for his slingshot. So if you go to the Jewish Review of Books, you'll find an article by Stuart Schaffman, who was an accomplished Israeli writer. And he found, the speech was never published, he found in the archives the typewritten manuscript, 21 pages of what Ben Hecht had delivered. And he published it in the Jewish Review of Books. I have a few paragraphs in my own book about it, but the place really to go to read virtually the complete speech and the background for it is the Jewish Review of Books.
Well, I want to thank you, Rick, very much for this afternoon. We will be, Ellen will announce it, but we'll be meeting next month and talk about with a fellow by the name John Sears, who's just written a very interesting book on Eleanor Roosevelt and the Holocaust and Eleanor Roosevelt and American and the quest for the Jewish state. And he'll have many interesting things to say about the dynamic relationship between Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And in one sense, the conclusion could be stated very simply. She saw things in a human term. He saw things in a political term.
Yeah.
We did not, the Jewish people during the Holocaust did not benefit from seeing things in a political sense without seeing it in the human sense. I'm grateful to you, Rick, and let me turn it back to Ellen, please.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rick, and thank you, Michael, for today's discussion. It was truly fascinating. I have tried to journal all of the books and all of the references that you spoke of, and I'll do my best to assure that we have that complete list in our follow-up email that we send with today's recording, as well as our evaluation. Again, as Michael mentioned, our next month, the third session of this series is on March 15th, and it is featuring John Sears. The title of that event is Refuge Must Be Given, Eleanor Roosevelt and the Holocaust. Next Thursday, we are starting our new series, an 8-part series with Tali Nates from the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. And that series will explore the multifaceted discipline of Holocaust studies through unique and previously unexplored lenses. That's a mouthful. Our first session will feature Dr. Robert Krell talking about psychiatry and the Holocaust. To sign up for these events and more, visit our website, www.cwbpgh.org. Stay safe, stay healthy. We'll see you all again soon. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Rick. Fascinating.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.